Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our parse demo, and specifically, we are going to look at how to parse an IPv4 IP address, Internet Protocol version 4 address. This is used for when you have two computers communicating with each other, or perhaps connecting to a website or an internet resource. Now, this video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on parsing using the Java programming language. Some of the principles we're going to see in these videos, though, can be extended to other languages, as there are many parallels. And this video is focusing on things like regular expressions, or this video series rather is focusing on regular expressions and just pattern matching in general. And the idea is that we're going to be looking for patterns within a string or within a block of text. Now, this video assumes that you have followed along with some of the earlier videos. As a matter of fact, we've already looked at how to identify an IP address in a block of text, as well as identifying whether a particular string is an IP address. So I encourage you to go back and take a look at those earlier videos. And if anything, in this video, we're going to create a more sophisticated example here, where I'm going to be passing not only a string as an input, but I'm also going to be utilizing an array list of strings to be able to capture then the results of parsing a block of text. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to pass that block of text on the command line, but you're going to quickly see we could easily do this with an input file as well. Now, to begin with, I want to point out that I already have a function called parse IPv4. We handled it in another video. And so there's a couple of things going on here. Number one, I wanted to provide you with an overload or an alternate way of going about doing this. And so you'll notice that these two functions share the same function name. However, the return types and the input arguments are different. The earlier example used an array of strings, whereas we are going to return a Boolean that will simply tell us true or false. Now, likewise, we could have done this with an array list, or again, even as an array. But again, for a little bit of variety here, I wanted you to see how you would go about doing this, in that I have passed a string as an input, but then I've also passed an array list of strings as an input argument. The idea is that I'm going to parse through the input string, and I'm just going to add the IP addresses to the array list. And so the very first thing that we're going to do differently in this particular video is we're going to go ahead and validate some of our input arguments, at least to a certain extent, to make sure that we do in fact have the ability to populate the array list. And so the first thing that we're going to do in our very, very primitive evaluation or validation here is we're going to make sure that our input itself is not equal to null. And so in other words, if it is equal to null, basically we have a problem, and we've got a couple of choices here. We can either throw an exception, or we can leverage our found variable, which also happens to be our return variable. And so if you think about it for just a second, basically, if our parse IPv4 function doesn't work, in other words, basically the input was null, or for whatever reason the array list was also null, basically our function never ran, and in that scenario, nothing was found. And so we can validly use the found variable to just simply indicate whether our function has in fact managed to run. So in this case, what we'll do here is we'll just simply provide then a system.out.println to the user, which again also may be optional. We can do it as an error or as a warning, but please provide, and in this case, I'm going to leave it pretty generic here, please provide valid input. And we're going to do the same thing now with another else statement, an else if here. And what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if our results are equal to null. Again, we don't really care what the size of the results are to begin with. We can debate about whether resetting them or not is a good idea. But what we're going to do is, again, if it is equal to null, we can't work with that. And we're just going to, again, say error, please provide a valid array list or results. And again, however you wish to word this is fine with me. Indicate basically that there is a problem And I probably overuse my exclamation points, but let's go ahead and put that in the message as well. And then under the else, what we're going to do is we're going to proceed to start parsing the input. Again, you could argue that we should be doing a little more validation on the input, perhaps, for instance, the length, because there has to be a minimum length for there even to be an IP address. But for right now, we're just going to leave it with the basic validation. Now, going back to the earlier videos, you will remember that we had to have a couple of objects to work with, our java.util.regex.pattern. What we are going to do a little different here is, because I want to validate my input arguments first, is I'm going to declare these variables, but I'm not going to initialize them. Again, for a little bit of variety, so you can see how you would go about doing this. And again, we have our java.util.regex.matcher, and I'm just simply going to call it matcher. I'm going to declare it, but I'm not going to initialize it. And in both cases, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait to do that down here. Again, with the pattern, remember that there is no constructor for the pattern class. Instead, what you're going to use is that factory method, that static method that you will find in the java.util.regex.pattern class, and that is our compile method. Now, much like before, I'm going to give you the regular expression. You could see it here at the top of our function, and as I've said in the other videos as well, this is not a complete example. Remember that we are not, in fact, checking for the range of values. In other words, we could accidentally have an IP address that had a 999 in it. And of course, that is, in fact, not a valid IP address. The other thing to note here is that NetBeans has a little bit of fun with this. It's actually trying to help us with the exception characters, but it doubles the number of exception characters when you paste it in there. And there are ways to get around that, but the easiest thing to do is just remember that and then do a find and replace to replace the quadruple slashes just with double slashes. All right, at this point, then what we want to do is we want to use our matcher against our pattern, and we want to call the matcher method. And we will now use our input, spelled correctly, of course, to our function. Now, what we learned in the first video is the .matches function just simply tells you whether a input matches the pattern perfectly, and then the .find function allows for you to cycle through each of the individual matches. In other words, the pattern can then be a substring of a larger string. So in this particular case, since the goal is that we're trying to find all of the IP addresses in a larger block of text, we would most logically use the find method associated with the matcher. And much like in the earlier example, that means that we might want to consider using a count variable. However, though, since we're dealing with an array list and not an array, we have the luxury of just simply adding elements to the array list. Now, before we go any further, I do want to take the opportunity to mention that we should consider resetting the array list. And again, it depends on the type of application that you are using as to whether or not you want to add to the existing elements in an array list or simply start over from scratch with a clean array list. For this particular example, I'm going to go ahead and reset or clear all of the elements in the array list. Essentially what it does is it starts us over with a 0-element array list. Again, it depends on the particular application, but at this point what we can do is we can use a while loop against our matcher.find. And remember that the matcher.find will essentially continue while the match is found in the input text. And again, you could drop off the double equals to true and simply leverage the matcher.find. Remember that effectively what happens is the matcher moves forward in the input text looking for each of the matches to the pattern. And then at this point, then the only thing to remind yourself of, and we can do this real quick with a system.out.println, is, of course, the matcher dot group count. And the other thing that you want to consider doing is just simply printing out the group itself. Now, at this point, what you can do is you can simply add to the array list. So in this case, our results dot add, and we can add the matcher dot group to the array list. And what we can do, depending on how you want to go about setting this up, I would consider perhaps an if statement or something here at the bottom. Or, for instance, having, again, as I mentioned, the count variable. There's a number of different ways that you can go about doing it. But ultimately, what you want to do is you want to indicate that we are successful in actually finding a match. And so there's a couple of ways that you can go about doing it. I'm not too sure I'm like this particular method, but one way is, of course, that you could just simply continue to set found equal to true, not preferred, because again, every instance of the matcher that finds something, every instance of the pattern that is found in the input will then trigger the found equal to true being written over and over again, or being assigned over and over again. Not the best way of going about doing it, but that does get us around having to create an additional variable. The other thing that you can do, and it's a little bit on the sneaky side, but of course that's perfectly fine, is for your found, what you can simply do here is you could say, you could check the results dot size, and if it is greater than 0, that will indicate that you have in fact found something. The problem with this approach is if you do not overwrite or do not clear the array, rather, then the results may already be greater than 0. So again, there's a couple of different ways that you can go about doing that. More importantly, basically, you want to indicate that you have in fact found something. So for this particular example, we'll leave it with a simple approach. It's not necessarily preferred. But let's go about now testing our function. There is, of course, also one other problem with using the results.size is because if for some reason a null array list was passed to our function and we try to leverage our results.size, we will in fact throw an exception. So again, there's a couple of different ways that we can go about doing this. So if we scroll now back up to our main, you'll recall that from an earlier video, we had returned an array list in our earlier example when we were parsing our IPv4. And we also already had set this up using 2 arguments on the command line. So what we'll do is we'll use a modified version of this, and we'll actually go back and tweak that earlier example, in that we also want to have the ability to pass the IP address on the command line as part of a larger body of text. And again, we could also pull this out of a file as well. And there's a couple of ways that we can go about doing this. We could simply just go ahead and modify the switch here to indicate that our parse IPv4 as array list was the switch that we needed to pass. And then for our earlier example, we will simply specify that we are doing a parse IPv4 as array. We could also add it as an additional argument. In other words, we would increase the argument count to 3 and then add an extra switch. Either approach is perfectly fine. At this point, though, what we want to do is we want to create a new variable here, and it's going to be of a system.util or rather java.util, sorry, java.util array list of strings. And we are going to call it our IPv4 as array list, perhaps a long variable name here. And then we're going to use the new constructor, which will allow for us to simply create then a new array list of strings. And again, you can go ahead and specify that it is an array list of strings. Now, keep in mind at this point, this is a 0 length. In other words, there's no elements in there. However, it is a valid it is a valid array list of strings, with the idea that we are going to store then our IP addresses in it. At this point, then what we want to do is also leverage a return value, a Boolean return value. And you'll notice that we already have our found up here, which we've used a couple of times before. And we can simply say found is equal to, and then we'll make a call to our IPv4 as array list function. We're going to pass our args square brackets 1, which again probably requires some additional validation. And then we can also pass the IPv4 as array list as the second argument. At this point, then let's see what we've got here as a typo. Oh, I have a typo here. I let my autocomplete get away with me here. Parse IPv4, sorry about that. And we pass then our args square brackets 1 as well as the newly created array list. And then at this point, though, what we can do is we can have a little bit of logic here that checks to see if found is equal to true, because remember that essentially tells us if our function worked correctly. And then under the else, then what we're going to have is a system.out.println that essentially says there was a problem. And so we're just going to follow this up with an error that says failed to parse IPv4. And under the true branch of our if statement, what we can do is we can set up either using a for loop or essentially a for each loop, doesn't really matter. We're going to use a for loop again for consistency with some of our earlier examples. We'll start off with for index equal to 0, index less than whatever the size is for our IPv4 as array list, and then increment using ++. And then what I'd like to do is, much like we did in our earlier example, just have a nice output to the command line that indicates that we have found our IPv4 address, followed by whatever that IPv4 as array list dot get has. All right, so at this point then, let's go ahead and build it one more time. We should have some working code. We can come back over to our command window. We can rerun our Java EE333 parse demo. And what we want to do is we want to run our IP or parse IPv4 as array list. And just to make sure our switches are working correctly, if we pass it with no arguments, there we go. We get the help, which we probably should update at some point. 192.168.1.254. Just a good sample IP address. And you can see here that I do successfully parse it. In other words, I get my group count of 1, and I get the group itself, and then the IPv4 comes back through the array list, through that results array list. Now I want to clean it up a little bit. Let's make a little extra noise down here in the function itself. I'm going to go ahead and add count here just so that we've got it, much like in our earlier example. And then what we can do is I'm just going to specify the group. So again, that seems like a reasonable thing to have there. Build it one more time. And then you could sort of see now where each of these pieces are coming from, where the noise is coming from on the command line. And then what we'll do is we'll follow this up with another example. And that I'm going to put this in quotes, and I'm going to turn it into a short block of text here. So 192.168.1.254 has a subnet mask of 255.255.0.0. Again, don't worry too much about what those values actually are. Again, we've got a number of holes in this that we need to work on, but you can see that I am now matching the pattern twice in the same input. And more importantly, I am returning it, or rather updating that array list. And so effectively what we've done is we have passed an array list that is being updated inside of the parse IPv4. And we also have the ability to have a return value of a Boolean that can tell us whether or not our function has ran successfully. You sort of get the best of both worlds without having to throw exceptions, as well as not having to work with arrays of strings. So hopefully you see the distinction between these two examples. If anything, remember to go back and modify the switches for your earlier examples so that you can call both of them. You can sort of see what the pros and cons of both of them are. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.